What do you define as indie? Because I've asked a few people this.
Yeah, well, I don't really think it's necessarily a genre, is it? Because it's really indie means you're not signed.
Yeah.
But it's kind of evolved to become this sort of Strawberry Dark Fruits bucket hat thing, isn't it?
It's kind of become its own thing.
Yeah, I think nowadays it can be perceived more as like. So you've got like mainstream pop, like your Katy Perry's and stuff.
Yeah.
Then you've got like the more alternative side of it, which can make bands can fall into that for indie bands like Tame Impala or Arctic Monkeys. Wombat's a great example of like a band I really, really like.
Yeah.
And they're definitely sort of indie garage pop, I guess. They've changed a lot. Like their first album was definitely sort of like indie rock.
Yeah.
But nowadays it's definitely more like indie pop.
That's something like when you label something indie rock or indie pop, like to me that changes what it's going to sound like, and I don't just mean it's sounding less produced. It does change.
Yeah,
and I don't know whether that has been like an active progression or just something that's came into itself. But like if I think of what I would consider rock, or what I would consider indie rock, they're different in my head.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
I think if we're gonna go into like the sonics of guitar specifically, you have a rock band, you're thinking like freaking like To the Book, overdrive or distortion sounds, and like big sounding drums or whatever. And then you go indie rock and you're thinking more of like, it's like it is a cleaner sound for the most part, I think. I feel like, I don't know, two albums that come to my head when I think indie rock is the Wombats' first album and Arctic Monkeys' first album. That's kind of the image I think of when I think of the term indie rock. Not necessarily because I think those bands are defined to indie rock. I just think those albums sound indie rock.
Yeah.
Because I don't think here's me just like labeling Wombats indie pop and stuff. I don't think indie pop is a genre, indie rock is a genre. I think it's more of a vibe that comes off of the sound.
So I just typed in indie rock into Spotify. We've got the Indie Rock Club. And the first 3 bands. Actually, I'll go 5 actually, because this is quite interesting.
Hit me.
So the first one is "Where Is My Mind" by Pixies.
Okay.
And the next one is "Seven Nation Army" by the White Stripes. "Are You Gonna Be My Girl" by Jet. "Take Me Out" Franz Ferdinand, and "How You Like Me Now" by The Heavy. And then "Lonely Boy" by the Black Keys, and then "Chelsea Dagger" by Fratellis. Fratellis would be, and then Vampire Weekend. Vampire Weekend would be the most in my mind that I would consider indie rock out of those artists.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the first few labelled. I feel like indie as a thing doesn't go back that far.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
As a label for a genre type thing.
Right. Okay, how far back do you think it goes?
I don't know. I feel like in terms of the bands that fall under it nowadays, kind of how I mentioned that, like the 2 columns of pop. You've got like mainstream pop, and then you've got like the more indie pop and rock artists. So like that would be where like Vampire Weekend and like the popular songs that aren't like mainstream pop. Do you see where I'm going? I don't feel like you have those bands without Britpop. It's called Britpop, isn't it? I really don't like Oasis or Blur.
Oasis is Britpop. I suppose you could maybe say Blur, but that kind of era of rock, I think, comes under the blanket of Britpop.
Yeah.
That's one of the few periods where I'd say it's more about a generational thing than it is a stylistic thing.
Yeah.
But slate me in the comments for that one. You know, but
yeah, we're just being open and thinking,
yeah,
thinking out loud.
Thinking, because yeah, like kind of that like A-punk. That I would say that's
indie song for sure.
But I would also say, like, could you see the Smiths as being indie rock? Because I would kind of say yes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, but I don't know how much of that is
but
hindsight labeling.
Yeah, but it's also, that would be referred to as jangle pop as well.
Yeah,
which is I suppose a different kind of genre. But I think indie rock and jangle pop, there's a lot of similarities between them.
There's a lot of crossover.
Because if you're thinking about sonic elements, like kind of more thin sounding, higher end guitars, clean guitar.
Jankly sounding, isn't it?
Jangly.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. But then, can music be defined by what it is perceived as when it is a thing, or what's perceived as 50 years later? What's more important? Like, can you label something for what it is in the moment, or should you wait 30 years, 40 years, whatever, look back and then label it? Because if you do that, you have an extra 30 years of future music from that moment to like compare it to kind of blur the lines of that label. Not that music needs labeling, but like.
But we like labels.
Yeah.
As people, don't we? We do like labels.
I just feel like the hindsight and knowing music that came after something can kind of change your perception of what something is called.
I said in 1985, when did Motley Crue become classic rock?
Exactly.
That's a thing. Yeah.
And I think this just kind of links to what you guys were talking about with, was it Dara and Sam, about dad rock and stuff?
Yeah.
And how that's dependent on at which point you look back and think about that type of music.
Yeah.
Because it's not called dad rock immediately. And I don't think necessarily, like, I mean, maybe the Pixies were deemed indie pop, but I don't think in the same way as they kind of are now.
If you've got a feeling that you can't put into words, don't worry, friends.
Because there's a song for that.